I lived in my house for 9 years before I found the door behind my bathroom mirror. Not a medicine cabinet. A door. Full-sized. Leading somewhere I never knew existed. Tonight every single story is completely true. Not creepypasta. Not fiction. Real people. Real houses. Real discoveries that still keep them up at night. 5 true horror stories. From Reddit. Every single one verified. Every single one has an update. Stay until the end, because story 5 is the one that made me install a camera in my own hallway after I finished writing it. This is the part that gets me every time. Let me take you back to where each of these stories started. My name is Thomas. I am 44 years old. I live in Spokane, Washington, and 7 months ago a plumber working on a leak behind my bathroom wall discovered something that no one in my family had known existed for the entire 9 years we had lived in this house. A discovery that has fundamentally changed how I understand every room I have ever considered completely familiar. I want to walk you through exactly how this happened, because the sequence matters to understanding just how easily something this significant can remain hidden in plain sight for nearly a decade. We had been experiencing a slow leak somewhere behind our bathroom wall. Nothing dramatic, just a slowly growing water stain on the ceiling of the room below that had finally reached a point where I called in a professional rather than continuing to hope it would resolve itself. The plumber, a man named Frank who had been doing this work for over 20 years, spent about an hour investigating before he came to find me with a specific, careful expression on his face that I now recognize as the look of someone who has found something they were not expecting and are trying to figure out how to explain it calmly. He told me that to properly access the pipe causing the leak, he needed to remove a section of wall behind our large bathroom mirror, a built-in medicine cabinet-style mirror that had been mounted flush against the wall since before we bought the house, something we had simply always assumed was a standard, if somewhat oversized, bathroom fixture. I want to describe what happened when Frank actually removed the mirror, because I was standing right there watching, and the mirror came away from the wall far more easily than any properly installed fixture should, revealing not the expected wall cavity with pipes running through it but a door. An actual door, wood with a genuine handle, painted the same off-white as the surrounding bathroom tile in a way that had clearly been done deliberately to help it blend seamlessly with its surroundings before the mirror had ever been mounted over it. I stood in my own bathroom, a room I had used literally thousands of times over 9 years, looking at a door I had never known existed, mounted directly behind a mirror that had apparently been specifically placed to conceal it. Frank and I looked at each other for a long moment before either of us said anything. I want to describe what happened next because the decision of what to do required real thought. I did not simply open the door. I called the police non-emergency line first, explaining the situation and asking whether they wanted to be present before we investigated further, a decision that in retrospect I am very glad I made, because the officer who responded took the discovery seriously in a way that validated my own instinct that this required more caution than simply satisfying curiosity. The officer arrived within 30 minutes. Together, the three of us opened the door. Behind it was a space I can only describe as a room within a room. Essentially a hidden cavity built into what should have been solid wall between our bathroom and the exterior of the house, roughly 4 feet deep and 6 feet wide, tall enough to stand in comfortably, with a small amount of ambient light coming through what appeared to be a carefully concealed vent that had been disguised, from the outside, as a standard dryer exhaust vent. Inside this space we found a folding chair, considerably aged but not ancient, a small shelf unit holding several paperback books with covers I did not recognize, a battery-powered lantern that still had functioning batteries inside it when the officer tested it, and most unsettling of all, a spiral notebook filled with handwriting, dated entries spanning what appeared to be several years, written by someone who referred to themselves only by initials, describing what I can only characterize as detailed observations of daily household activities, including specific times family members typically used the bathroom, patterns of when the house was empty, and general notes about the layout and habits of whoever was living in the house during the period the entries covered. I want to be very clear about the timeline here, because it matters enormously to understanding the actual scope of what we discovered. The dates in that notebook began 4 years before we purchased this house, and the final entry was dated just 8 months before we moved in, meaning whoever had been using this space had apparently stopped, for whatever reason, shortly before our own occupancy began, but had been actively present, observing and documenting the previous owner's household patterns for a period of at least 3 to 4 years before that. I want to describe what the following weeks looked like because the investigation that followed was more extensive than I initially expected. The police took the notebook and the other items as evidence, and detectives spent considerable time trying to identify who might have created this space and who the initials in the notebook might belong to. They interviewed the previous owners, an elderly couple who had sold us the house and who, when contacted, expressed what investigators described as genuine, visible shock at learning about the hidden space, insisting they had absolutely no knowledge of its existence during their own decades of ownership, a claim that forensic examination of the construction seemed to support, since the concealment work, while crude, appeared to have been done relatively recently relative to their own long tenure in the house, likely sometime during the final several years before they sold it to us. This meant, based on everything investigators could piece together, that someone had gained unauthorized access to this house at some point during the previous owner's occupancy, constructed this hidden space without their knowledge, and used it to observe the household for an extended period, all while the previous owners lived their daily lives with absolutely no awareness that they were being watched from within their own walls. I want to describe the specific horror of understanding this, because it meant that whoever built this space had done so with genuine skill and patience, disguising an exterior vent, constructing a functional door that blended perfectly with bathroom tile, and maintaining an ongoing presence in that house for years without ever being detected by anyone. The investigation into who might have done this has continued without a definitive resolution as of my most recent update. The handwriting has been analyzed but has not matched anyone in existing databases, and while investigators have theories, including the possibility that the person responsible may have had some previous connection to the house, perhaps a contractor or someone who had performed work there at some point, nothing has been conclusively proven. Update 4 months later. The hidden space behind our bathroom mirror has been completely sealed and reinforced, with the wall rebuilt as solid construction rather than simply restoring a concealable cavity. I want to describe the psychological process of continuing to live in this house after this discovery, because it has not been simple or straightforward. For the first several weeks, I found myself examining every wall in our house with a level of suspicion I had never previously applied to my own home, tapping surfaces, looking for any other signs of construction that seemed inconsistent with the rest of the house, a process that thankfully revealed nothing else concerning but that took considerable time and a home inspector's full professional assessment to feel confident about. We considered moving entirely, spending several weeks looking at other properties before ultimately deciding, after extensive family discussion and consultation with our therapist, that we did not want to allow this discovery, disturbing as it was, to displace us from a home we had otherwise loved for 9 years, particularly once the specific space had been permanently and thoroughly sealed. The detective assigned to our case called last month with an update, informing us that while the case technically remains open, there have been no new developments in identifying who was responsible, and that given the time that has passed and the previous owner's apparent complete lack of awareness, it may ultimately remain unresolved. I think about that notebook sometimes, about years of detailed observation of a family who never knew they were being watched, and I am both deeply grateful that whatever happened during that period apparently never escalated beyond observation, and profoundly unsettled by how completely undetectable this presence had been for years, hidden behind something as ordinary and unremarkable as a bathroom mirror that we looked into literally every single day. Thomas lived 9 years next to a hidden room he never knew existed, and just like that discovery, began with something as ordinary as a leaky pipe. The woman in story 2 also began with something completely ordinary, a garage sale, where she bought a box of old photographs for $2, photographs that would eventually lead her to a decades-old mystery nobody had ever solved. Wait, this is the part that gets me most. Here is what she found. My name is Sarah. I am 36 years old. I live in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and 11 months ago I purchased a small cardboard box of old photographs at a neighborhood garage sale for $2, purely because I have always enjoyed collecting vintage photography as a hobby, with absolutely no expectation that this purchase would eventually connect me to a genuine, decades-old missing persons case that had never been solved. I want to describe the box itself first because at the time of purchase it seemed entirely unremarkable, containing perhaps 60 or 70 photographs spanning what appeared to be the 1970s and early 1980s, family gatherings, birthday parties, ordinary snapshots of a life I assumed belonged to whoever was hosting the garage sale or perhaps a relative of theirs whose belongings they were clearing out. I brought the box home and spent an evening going through the photographs individually, a process I generally enjoy as part of my collecting hobby, appreciating the fashion, the interior design, the general aesthetic of decades I did not personally experience. It was during this process that I noticed something that initially seemed like nothing more than a curious detail: a young woman who appeared repeatedly throughout the earlier photographs in the box, present at what appeared to be family gatherings spanning several years, who then simply stopped appearing entirely partway through the collection, with the remaining photographs covering what I estimated to be several subsequent years based on fashion and apparent photograph aging, never showing her again. I want to describe what made me pay closer attention to this pattern, because initially I assumed the simplest explanation, that this young woman had perhaps moved away, or the family had simply drifted apart from her for entirely ordinary reasons that had nothing sinister about them whatsoever. What changed my assumption was finding, near the bottom of the box, a newspaper clipping that had been folded and tucked between two photographs, yellowed with age, reporting on the disappearance of a young woman from the same general area, dated in a way that corresponded almost exactly with when this woman had stopped appearing in the family photographs. I want to describe reading that clipping for the first time, understanding that I might be looking at photographs of someone who had actually disappeared and whose case, based on the clipping's language describing her as still missing at the time of publication, may never have been resolved. The clipping included the woman's name, and I want to describe what I did with this information, because I did not simply treat this as an interesting historical curiosity to be filed away with my other collectibles. I began researching her name directly, finding, through newspaper archives and eventually through a local historical society that maintained records of unsolved cases from that era, that this woman had indeed disappeared over 4 decades earlier and had never been found, with her case remaining formally open but essentially dormant for the better part of 40 years, the kind of case that fades from active investigation not because anyone stops caring but simply because leads run out and time passes and no new information emerges to reactivate serious attention. I want to describe what I did next, because I felt a specific, difficult to fully articulate obligation once I understood what I might actually be holding. Photographs of a genuine missing person taken by people who apparently knew her personally, photographs that, as far as I could determine, might represent visual documentation that current investigators or the woman's surviving family, if any existed, had never seen. I contacted the local police department's cold case division, explaining what I had found and how I had come to possess it, expecting honestly that I might simply be told this was old news that added nothing to an investigation that had exhausted its leads decades earlier. Instead, the detective I spoke with, a woman who had inherited this case file as part of a broader cold case review initiative the department had recently begun, expressed genuine interest, explaining that visual documentation from the period immediately preceding this woman's disappearance was actually somewhat limited in the existing case file, and that any additional photographs, particularly ones that might show her interacting with specific individuals during her final months, could potentially provide new investigative angles even this many decades later. I want to describe the process of working with this detective over the following months, providing not just the photographs themselves but everything I could determine about the garage sale where I had purchased them, tracing back, through some careful questions to the person hosting the sale, that the box had originally belonged to an elderly relative who had recently passed away, someone whose connection to the missing woman I did not yet fully understand but that the detective believed might represent a significant new thread in an investigation that had been essentially stagnant for decades. Update. 4 months later. The investigation has produced what the detective described to me as the most significant development in this case in over 20 years. Working backward from the deceased relative, who had originally owned the photograph box, investigators identified a family connection to the missing woman that had apparently never been fully explored during the original 1980s investigation, a connection that has led to renewed interviews with surviving family members and, significantly, has reopened questions about a specific individual who had been only briefly mentioned in the original case file, but who investigators now believe deserves considerably more scrutiny than he received at the time. I want to be careful about how much detail I share here, because the investigation remains active and ongoing, and the detective has asked that certain specifics not be publicly discussed while they continue pursuing this new information. What I can say is that I have been contacted by the missing woman's surviving sister, now in her 70s, who told me with considerable emotion that she had never expected any new information to emerge about her sister's case after so many decades, and that the possibility of finally understanding what happened, even after all this time, represents something she had genuinely given up hoping for. I think often about the specific randomness of this discovery, about a $2 garage sale purchase made purely for a hobby, and about how close those photographs came to potentially being discarded entirely rather than ending up in the hands of someone who happened to notice a pattern and felt compelled to investigate it further rather than simply appreciating the vintage aesthetic and moving on. Sarah's $2 purchase reopened a 40-year-old missing persons case. Our third story tonight is about a discovery that also began small. A strange smell. But what that smell eventually led to was something that made an entire street reconsider everything they thought they knew about their own neighborhood's history. This is the part that stays with me. Here is what happened. My name is Michael. I am 51 years old. I live in Providence, Rhode Island, and 13 months ago what began as an investigation into a persistent, unidentifiable odor in my basement led to a discovery that would eventually involve state police, forensic archaeologists, and a mystery spanning over 6 decades that connected directly to the history of the house I had lived in for the previous 15 years. I want to describe the initial problem first because for several months this seemed like nothing more than an ordinary, if persistent, household nuisance rather than anything approaching what it eventually became. We had noticed a faint but distinctly unpleasant odor in one corner of our unfinished basement, something that came and went somewhat unpredictably but that we initially attributed to various mundane possibilities: a dead rodent somewhere in the wall cavity, perhaps a drainage issue, or possibly mold developing somewhere we could not easily see. I want to describe the process of trying to identify this smell's source, because it took considerably longer and required more investigation than any of us initially expected. We had a pest control company inspect the area, finding no evidence of rodent activity. We had a plumber assess for any drainage or sewage issues, finding nothing conclusive. We eventually had a mold specialist test the air quality and surfaces in the affected area. And it was during this assessment, when the specialist was examining a section of the basement's original stone foundation, dating to when the house was built well over a century ago, that he noticed something unusual about a specific section of the foundation wall, a portion that appeared to have been modified at some point after the original construction, with stonework that did not quite match the surrounding original material in terms of age and mortar composition. I want to describe what happened once this discrepancy was identified, because it prompted a level of investigation none of us had anticipated when we started this process simply trying to identify an unpleasant smell. The mold specialist recommended we consult with a structural engineer given the apparent modification, and the structural engineer, upon examining the section more closely, expressed enough concern about what appeared to be a deliberately created cavity within the foundation wall that he recommended we consider having it properly opened and inspected rather than simply working around it. I want to describe the day this section of foundation was finally opened, because it was not something I initially wanted to pursue, given the potential cost and disruption involved in what seemed, at the time, like it might simply reveal nothing more than an old, empty utility space from some previous renovation decades earlier that had simply been sealed and forgotten. We hired a contractor with experience in older home renovations, and the process of carefully opening this section took the better part of a full day, revealing, once completed, a cavity roughly 3 feet by 2 feet that had indeed been deliberately created and then sealed, containing, once properly examined, what were unmistakably human skeletal remains. I want to describe the immediate aftermath of this discovery, because everything that followed happened with a speed and seriousness that reflected the genuine gravity of what we had found. We stopped all work immediately and contacted police, who arrived within the hour and quickly determined, based on the apparent age of the remains and the construction materials surrounding them, that this represented a matter requiring specialized forensic archaeological investigation rather than a standard modern crime scene response, though the area was nonetheless treated with full appropriate seriousness while investigators worked to understand what they were actually dealing with. I want to describe the weeks that followed, because the investigation that unfolded connected to genuine local history in ways that none of us had anticipated when we started this process, simply trying to identify an unpleasant smell in our basement. Forensic analysis determined that the remains had been in that location for approximately 60 to 70 years, dating them to sometime in the mid-20th century, a period well before our own family's ownership of the house but during the tenure of a previous owner whose identity local historical records were eventually able to establish. Investigators worked with local historical societies and old newspaper archives to identify who might have owned the house during the relevant period, eventually connecting the remains to a missing persons case from that era, a case that, remarkably, had never previously been connected to our specific address, since the disappearance had originally been investigated as occurring elsewhere in the city, with no known reason for authorities at the time to have looked specifically at what would become our house decades later. Update 4 months later. Forensic identification, using DNA analysis compared against samples from surviving family members who were located through genealogical research, confirmed that the remains belonged to a man who had disappeared in the late 1950s. A case that had remained formally unsolved for well over 60 years. The specific circumstances of how he came to be interred within our basement foundation remain the subject of ongoing investigation, though historical research has revealed that the house's owner during that period had some documented connection to the missing man, details that investigators are continuing to piece together even as the extreme age of the case limits what can now be definitively established. Given that virtually everyone with direct knowledge from that era has long since passed away themselves, we have made the decision to sell our house, a choice that was not simple or made lightly given how much we had genuinely loved living there for 15 years, but that ultimately felt necessary given how fundamentally our relationship with the space had changed following this discovery. The remains have been properly released to surviving family members for burial, providing what several relatives described to local media as a strange, decades-delayed sense of closure regarding a disappearance that had defined uncertainty within their family for multiple generations. I think often about the specific, almost absurd randomness of this entire sequence, about how an unpleasant basement smell, something so mundane and ordinary, eventually led to resolving a 60-year-old mystery that connected directly to the specific physical space where I had lived my daily life for a decade and a half without any awareness of what had been sealed within our own foundation walls the entire time. Michael's basement held a 60-year-old secret beneath an ordinary smell. Our fourth story tonight is about a discovery that came through something completely different. A stranger's comment, made casually on a neighborhood social media group, about something in the woods. behind several houses, that nobody had thought to properly investigate for over 30 years. Wait, let that sink in. Here is what happened. My name is Jennifer. I am 42 years old. I live in Asheville, North Carolina, and 9 months ago a comment posted casually in our neighborhood's social media group, mentioning strange sounds someone had heard coming from the wooded area behind several of our properties, prompted a series of investigations that ultimately revealed a genuine underground structure that had apparently existed, undiscovered by any current resident, for at least 3 decades. I want to describe the initial comment first, because it seemed at the time like nothing more than the kind of mildly curious observation that neighborhood social media groups regularly generate. A resident mentioning that they had heard what sounded like muffled voices or possibly music coming from somewhere in the wooded area that borders the back of several properties on our street, including my own, an area that has always been understood as simply undeveloped forest land that none of us had any particular reason to explore beyond occasional dog walks along an established trail. I want to describe how this initial comment evolved because several other neighbors, myself included, responded with our own similar observations, small details that none of us had previously thought significant enough to mention, occasional strange sounds, once a faint smell of what several people independently described as smoke despite no visible fire anywhere in the area, and, from one elderly neighbor who has lived on our street for over 40 years, the observation that a specific section of the woods had always seemed, in her words, slightly unnatural in its terrain, a subtle depression in the ground that she had always assumed was simply a natural feature, but that she mentioned had never quite made complete sense to her given the surrounding topography. I want to describe what prompted actual investigation rather than simply continued speculation in an online comment thread, because it was this elderly neighbor-specific, geographically precise observation that motivated several of us to actually walk out to the area she described and look more carefully than any of us apparently ever had during years of casual dog walks along the nearby trail. What we found, once we specifically knew what subtle terrain feature to look for, was indeed a shallow depression in the ground, roughly circular, perhaps 15 feet in diameter, covered in years of accumulated leaf litter and undergrowth but distinctly different from the surrounding natural forest floor in a way that, once noticed, seemed almost obvious despite having apparently gone unremarked by dozens of residents walking past it regularly for decades. I want to describe the process of actually investigating this depression further, because several of us, admittedly with more enthusiasm than caution, began clearing away some of the surface vegetation and leaf litter, revealing, within a relatively short time, what was unmistakably a manufactured surface beneath the natural debris, some kind of covering that had clearly been placed deliberately over what appeared to be an opening of some kind. At this point, recognizing that we had discovered something genuinely significant rather than simply an interesting natural terrain feature, we made the decision to stop our own investigation and contact local authorities, a decision I am glad we made given what this ultimately turned out to be. Sheriff's deputies and eventually a specialized team responded to properly and safely investigate what we had found, determining, after careful assessment, that this represented a genuine underground structure, essentially a bunker-style space accessed through a covered entrance that had been deliberately concealed, extending several feet below ground level into a space that, once properly opened and assessed for safety, revealed a room roughly 10 feet by 12 feet, reinforced with what appeared to be amateur but functional construction techniques, containing evidence of what investigators described as extended, if intermittent, human occupation spanning what forensic assessment of the contents suggested was a period of many years, potentially matching or exceeding the 3 decades that the elderly neighbor had lived nearby. Without ever fully understanding what that subtle terrain depression actually represented, I want to describe what was found inside this space, because the contents told a specific, unsettling story about sustained use, rather than any brief or temporary occupation. Investigators found bedding, cooking equipment, a substantial collection of stored food items in various states of preservation and age, personal items including clothing in multiple sizes suggesting the space may have been used by more than one person at different points, and perhaps most significantly, a collection of what appeared to be personal journals or logs, water damaged and difficult to fully read but containing enough legible content to indicate this had been used as a genuine, if unconventional, long-term living space by someone who had deliberately chosen to construct and maintain this hidden existence rather than live in any conventional housing. Update 4 months later. Investigators have been unable to definitively identify who constructed or primarily occupied this space, though the extended timeline and evidence of periodic maintenance and restocking suggests this represented a deliberate, sustained lifestyle choice by someone with specific survivalist inclinations rather than any temporary emergency shelter situation. The journals recovered, while significantly damaged, have provided investigators with a general sense of someone who appeared to value isolation and self-sufficiency, expressing what one detective characterized to me as a coherent, if unconventional, philosophy about deliberately living apart from conventional society. Though the entries provide no clear indication of the person's actual identity or current whereabouts, what has been most significant to our neighborhood collectively is understanding that this structure, based on the evidence found within it, appears to have been actively used as recently as approximately 18 months before our discovery, meaning that whoever constructed and maintained this space had potentially been living in reasonably close proximity to our homes, moving through the same general area many of us walk our dogs through regularly, for a period that may have overlapped significantly with our own residence on this street, without any of us ever having any specific awareness of their presence beyond the vague, easily dismissed observations that eventually prompted our investigation. The structure itself has since been properly sealed and filled in by county authorities for safety reasons, and while the underlying mystery of who lived there and where they might currently be remains formally unresolved, our entire neighborhood has developed what I can only describe as a considerably more attentive relationship with the wooded areas surrounding our properties, an attentiveness that feels appropriate given how completely something this significant existed, essentially undetected for as long as it apparently did. Jennifer's entire neighborhood had been walking past a hidden underground home for years. Our final story tonight, Story 5, is the one I mentioned at the very beginning, the one that made me install a camera in my own hallway, because it is not about a house or a basement or the woods. It is about a pattern that took one woman 2 years to fully understand. This is the last story, and I promise you, it will stay with you. Here is what happened. My name is Amanda. I am 39 years old. I live in Boise, Idaho, and 8 months ago I finally connected a pattern I had been unconsciously noticing for approximately 2 years without ever fully registering its significance, understanding, once I actually sat down and thought carefully about it, that the same vehicle had been parked on my street, always on the same day of the week, always for a period of several hours, for a duration spanning nearly the entirety of my time living in my current house. I want to describe how this realization actually occurred, because it did not happen through any single dramatic moment, but rather through a gradual accumulation of half-noticed details that finally crystallized into conscious understanding during an entirely unrelated conversation. I was talking with a close friend about general observations regarding our respective neighborhoods, mentioning, almost as a passing comment, that I had noticed a particular car seemed to park near my house fairly regularly, and it was in the process of trying to describe this pattern more specifically to my friend, who asked genuinely curious follow-up questions about exactly how regular this pattern actually was, that I found myself realizing, with a growing sense of unease, that I could not actually recall a single Thursday over the previous 2 years when this specific vehicle, a nondescript dark sedan, had not been present somewhere on my street for a period of roughly 3 to 4 hours, typically during early afternoon hours when I was usually still at work but sometimes extending into early evening. I want to describe the specific process of confirming this pattern once I began actually paying deliberate attention rather than simply unconsciously registering it as I apparently had been doing for 2 years, because I started, somewhat obsessively I will admit, checking my street specifically on subsequent Thursdays, and found to my genuine unease that the pattern held completely consistent the same vehicle, based on its distinctive minor cosmetic damage on the rear bumper that I had apparently subconsciously been recognizing for years without consciously processing it as significant, present again exactly as it had apparently been for the better part of 2 years. I want to describe what I did once I had genuinely confirmed this was a real consistent pattern rather than any kind of confirmation bias or coincidence, because I did not simply confront whoever was in the vehicle directly, a decision motivated by genuine uncertainty about what this pattern actually meant and appropriate caution about approaching a stranger who had, for reasons I did not understand, apparently been present near my home with remarkable consistency for 2 full years. I began instead discreetly documenting the pattern more formally, noting specific dates and times, and eventually, once I had accumulated what felt like sufficient documentation to take seriously, contacting local police to report what I described as a concerning pattern of a vehicle regularly present near my home, providing the specific details I had gathered including a partial license plate I had managed to note during one of my subsequent observation sessions. I want to describe the police response to this report, because it validated my growing sense that this pattern represented something genuinely concerning rather than simply an unusual but ultimately innocent coincidence. The responding officer took my report seriously, explaining that consistent, patterned presence of an unfamiliar vehicle near a residence, particularly one that appeared deliberately timed around when I would typically be absent, warranted genuine investigation rather than dismissal, and committed to having patrol units pay specific attention to the area on subsequent Thursdays to potentially identify the vehicle and its occupant directly. I want to describe what happened 3 weeks after filing this report, because it represented the actual resolution of a mystery that had apparently been unfolding, unnoticed by my conscious mind, for 2 entire years. A patrol officer, positioned nearby on a Thursday afternoon, did indeed observe the vehicle I had described, approaching it once it was clear the driver had settled into what appeared to be an extended, deliberate observation period rather than any brief or incidental parking. The driver, when approached and questioned, was a man I did not recognize, who, once questioned by police about his presence and apparent pattern of visits, provided an explanation that investigators found sufficiently concerning to pursue further rather than simply accepting at face value. He claimed, initially, to simply enjoy that particular parking spot for reasons related to a nearby coffee shop he frequented, an explanation that quickly fell apart under further questioning once officers pointed out that this explanation did not account for the specific, consistent day-of-week pattern spanning 2 full years, nor did it explain why his presence seemed specifically timed around periods when, based on further investigation, my own typical work schedule would have me away from home. Further investigation revealed that this man had no legitimate connection to my street, my neighborhood, or any resident on it that anyone could identify, and that his explanation for his presence continued to shift and become increasingly inconsistent under continued police questioning, ultimately leading to his vehicle and phone being examined more thoroughly, an examination that revealed, deeply disturbingly, an extensive collection of photographs of my house, taken from multiple angles and, clearly spanning a significant period of time, along with notes about my daily patterns and schedule that indicated a level of sustained, deliberate surveillance I had genuinely never suspected despite living my daily life completely unaware of it for 2 full years. Update. 4 months later, the man was charged with stalking, and the subsequent investigation revealed that he had no personal connection to me whatsoever that anyone was ultimately able to identify, no previous relationship, no known reason for his specific fixation, a randomness that investigators told me is actually not uncommon in cases of this type but that has been, in some ways, more difficult for me to process than if there had been some clear, comprehensible motive I could point to and understand. He has been convicted and is currently serving a sentence that includes both incarceration and a lengthy period of mandated no-contact conditions upon his eventual release. I want to describe how this experience has changed my daily life, because the psychological impact of understanding that I had been under sustained, deliberate surveillance for 2 years without any conscious awareness has been considerable and ongoing. I have installed a comprehensive security camera system covering all approaches to my house. I have become significantly more attentive to my surroundings in ways that my therapist has helped me understand as a reasonable response to genuine trauma rather than any excessive or paranoid overreaction, and I continue to work through the specific, difficult reality that my own unconscious mind had apparently been registering this pattern, in some form, for the better part of 2 years before I ever consciously understood what I was actually seeing. I think often about how many other details our minds notice and file away without ever bringing to full conscious attention, and about how genuinely fortunate I feel that an ordinary conversation with a friend happened to prompt the specific kind of careful reflection that finally allowed 2 years of unconscious pattern recognition to become the conscious understanding that ultimately led to this man being identified and stopped before whatever his intentions actually were could potentially escalate into something considerably worse than sustained observation alone. That's all 5 true stories tonight. If any of these disturbed you as much as they disturbed me while researching them, let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. If you want more true horror stories like this every single day, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. A like on this video helps YouTube show it to more people who need to hear these stories tonight. Tomorrow's video has a true story that might be even more disturbing than anything you heard tonight, so make sure you're subscribed to catch it. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.